Hey everyone, so today I'm going to be doing a developer log for our indie game Adventure In Aellion. For this first developer log, I'm actually going to go over something that we updated a couple of months ago, and that was collisions. So in the previous few builds of Aellion, we were doing an awful lot of per poly collision, which is where it's using every single polygon in the game as a collision. That's incredibly wasteful. But it was convenient at the time as the fastest way for us to get the game out and have players testing it before we moved on from that. But part of that is going back over any meshes that we missed that didn't have proper collisions set up. And so, without further ado, let's just get right into it. So here we are in the world of Aellion. And this is just the planes that are already in access. They're already accessible in early access. So if you were to go and play now, this is the scenery that you'd be greeted with. So starting area over here, first dungeons over here, and the Aletha village over here. Excellent, there we go. Hello, Chief. Oh, wait, no, you're not the Chief. There's the Chief. The one outside used to be the Chief before we got him sat down. But in this video, we are not going over the overworld or its various inhabitants. Instead, in this video, we will be going over collisions. As you can see, the handy-dandy wall going around the whole world, keeping players inside the certain playable area at the minute to keep them in the areas that we've actually developed and not into the areas that we haven't finished yet. Instead, let's go to the Rune Tower, and here we see is the latest dungeon to get the collisions update. And what that means is if we go over here and turn on player collision, you can see what the computer sees. Now, visualizing collisions is a lot harder than just running the game normally, but it serves its purpose. You can see here how instead of all of the incredibly detailed walls, they now instead are represented with a nice smooth surface. And that continues on through most of the dungeon, where normally you see very large detailed environments. You instead get a very basic surface for the player to actually run around on. And that's by design. When you have a collision, every single polygon then has to be calculated with forces and whether to let the character pass or not. So it's much easier to instead have these very, very basic formations of collisions. Now, if we go over to an older copy of the project, you can instead see just how different the environment is. Every single part of this wall is served as a different collision mesh that needs to be rendered separately. And this goes on throughout the entire dungeon, where instead of having one smooth polygon to render, you instead have thousands. So if we take this small treasure room, for example, you've got the old project and the new project, where far less detail that has to be rendered all at once. So what we can do is pick an example room, and I can demonstrate to you exactly how we create our levels of detail and our collision meshes for the game, using this room from the old version. So if we go here, we'll pick this room. Treasure room wall. So it's just the walls, no floor. The floor is a separate part of the mesh. You can see what it looks like from the outside. You can see here that we also do most of our detail in mesh rather than using textures. That's by design for this game. We didn't want to be dealing with normal maps or high-res textures. It wouldn't suit the art style of the game. So, but that can be a separate video. So instead, we're going to asset actions, and export to a folder of our choice. And when that's done, we can come into Max and import it here. So it's all just your basic import of an FBX. And here we go. 1 treasure room minus floor. So rather than how we would have done it in the past using different UBXs and UCXs, what we instead do, so that'll be our original reference. So it's about 8,000 polys. And this is the one that we're going to use to develop our lower detailed mesh. So what I actually end up doing is, so I usually, while producing these meshes, is I'll create the lower detail one first and then produce the higher detailed ones from that. But this is a good case of where we just went straight into producing a higher detailed mesh, and it's easy enough to go back, export things from the engine and create lower levels of detail from that. If we attach that. This really works now out in our favour. So we take the more standout aspects of the mesh, such as these decorative pieces, select those parts, deselect the bottom. So the player is going to be running into these parts of the walls, but they are very unlikely to be touching the ceiling. So we just need to get rid of that part there. And just bring these up. That way you got rid of all of that detail going over the ceiling there, and instead we're just left with these basic polygons here. So again, the player is very unlikely to be interacting with the roofs. There is no reason to waste detail on these arches. So the next problem would be this door frame. Door frame's a lot more complex, and it's going to take a lot more time to go through in detail. But there's the fun part with the art style of our game, and it's a kind of cheat, where if we go into the modifier tab and look at one of these tools, Pro Optimizer, you should never ever be using this tool if you're doing this with more photoreal assets, with meshes that are more uniform. Very, very bad idea. But because it suits our aesthetic, we don't have to worry about it. And what this is going to do is it's going to use a very crude algorithm to figure out what parts of the model it can crunch at any one time. So we'll keep textures and UV boundaries, protect the borders, and borders are any open-ended polygon, so at the bottom here, an edge that doesn't have a polygon on it is a border. We'll hit calculate. Now it's done its work, and we get to choose just how low detail it goes. So that's a bit too low detail there on the left here. So instead we just back that up until it starts to conform to its more original shape, and we can see, while keeping the rough shape for the player, that's easily gone down to a quality that'd be a lot easier on the CPU to process collisions at 1/5 of the polygon count. Easy as that. And sometimes you might want to just clean up a few parts, so that's how we do the more complex parts. But what can be equally as fun is just really quick and dirty doing the walls. And the walls, hitting F4, you can easily bring up your edge. It's nothing amazing. Just bring out something that's already there, so that you've already got the texture information on it. New object. Bring that down in line with the floor, up into the roof. Bridge the two. Connect. 2 segments for the door. One last connect for the top. Scale. And then bring those into the wall. All you need to do then is just a bit of cleanup. Make sure that it fits the wall properly, so you can see it's kind of poking through a little bit here. So just bring it forward so the player won't clip through that wall. Bring this one in a little bit so the player isn't clipping through that one. And the same here, just in a little bit. Set flow and set flow. There, just fine. And again, it's a little cheating, but don't need to do a roof because the player isn't really going to be able to get up there. But hey, now you know you can poke if you're watching this video and you poke around in our games. Try the roof, see if you're able to get through them. Some of them you will, some of them you won't. Last one here would be just sorting out that bit. There we go. And that's how you turn an 8,000 poly mesh into a 250 poly mesh. Technically triangles is what we care about, but hey. And you say, oh, but Luke, that's only a level of detail. That's not a collision mesh. Well, you'll see. LOD1, and then we just export as usual. So these are the settings that we usually go with. You really want to have Max do the triangulation rather than letting Unreal Engine do it. But other than that, it's up to you. Now, even though we don't use smoothing groups in our models to give it that crunched polygon look, you need to export with smoothing groups regardless. Otherwise, Unreal will just calculate them and just smooth everything back out again. So here we are back in Unreal Engine. Let's go back to player collision. And level of detail, import LOD1. Sometimes it'll complain, but honestly, well, just for the purposes of this video, we're going to ignore that. So here we are in the actual settings of the mesh itself. So you get to see the basic LOD. And what we can see here is it's tried to change some settings, but we don't need to worry about that. So here we'll just do a quick check over, no light map resolutions. Set that down to 4. LOD1. Here you go, this is the really basic version, but you can see it's using the default world material. Well, we don't want that. Default, delete the extra one. We'll set the screen size to something small like 0.2. So you can see screen space, screen size is over here, and what that really means is that as you get closer or further away from the mesh, that's when the engine is going to decide when to swap it over. So if we set back to auto, screen size is 1. That means at screen size of 1, it'll be showing this, the higher detailed mesh. But with LOD2, with the LOD1, the low detailed, we set it to 0.2. That means it won't change until we drop down past the 0.2. Which is fine for our purposes, because it'll inside the dungeon here, it'll be culled optically long before you reach LOD2. But that isn't what we're interested in. What we're interested in is the collision mesh. So we go down to here. Normally, this is project default. This is when it would be using UBX's, UCX's dedicated collision meshes. But instead, what we want is to use complex collision. And complex collision is basically when it uses a per poly collision instance. Which you can see at the minute is using the 8,000 triangle mesh, but we don't want that. Instead, we'll go over here to LOD collision. Now that's where things get more interesting. So if we hit 1, you can see on here and on here it has changed to using the lower resolution mesh as the dedicated collision mesh. And I think there was another setting I wanted to change just for the sake, there we go. Light map resolution, because we're only using dynamic lighting, we don't want light map resolution, it takes up memory. And then from here we can change how the camera behaves, or how the collision behaves. Sometimes you'll want no collision, that's pretty self-explanatory. Custom is when you get to change things like camera. So you'll see that when you go through the world, like where the camera can pass through trees and stuff. This is what stops the camera from bumping off of every single object you could possibly see. But for our purposes here, when it comes to walls and things where you don't want people to look behind the curtain, as 'twere, then you get the idea of why game developers stop players from looking behind the scenery. And that's the quick and dirty way of doing it. And honestly, for our purposes for this game, and I think an awful lot of developers would find that it's surprisingly a great number of games, it works perfectly fine, because you already have the draw call in there for the level of detail anyway. And the draw call is the times that the CPU has to take up in order to bring the mesh forwards anyway. And it's suitably low detail for our needs. Certainly far lower detail than over here. But for the sake of it, if we go back in here, what about if we wanted to make a UCX or a UBX mesh? And a UCX UBX is the Unreal specific mesh naming system that relies on full enclosed geometry. So that means you would need an enclosed box, an enclosed sphere, those kinds of things, dedicated meshes. And the problem with that is that you end up wasting polygons. So if we look over here, any polygon we didn't need has been taken out. Didn't need any backing polygons here. But instead, if we wanted to do the same thing, we want our old reliable box and start working on it from here. And this is just for the sake of it. So what you would do here is at the end of it, you want it to be called exactly the same thing. But you put 001 at the end, and at the start, you would want UBX, because it's a box, underscore. And UBX means Unreal Box Collision. If it was something like a custom concave shape, then it would be called a UCX. But it has to stay a box. That means you can't go edit poly and then start tweaking around with your vertices. Then it's no longer a box anymore. So and there we go. That's a rough, really rough way of getting a UBX mesh. And as you can see, there's a lot of wasted polygons. It's just not needed. It's honestly kind of an archaic way of doing it. I don't know why, and a lot of documentation, a lot of people still recommend using UBXs and UCXs. Like at that point, you just may as well go into Unreal Engine. So yeah, here's a fun one. You can go collision, and here there's a whole bunch of different ways of creating stuff. So capsule, there you go. There's now a giant capsule mesh all around the outside. Let's hit save and see what happens. So that's why, if you're wondering why the game would be running faster after one of our most recent updates, is because that's basically what we've been doing throughout the entire game. Is in this project file you can see smooth. So yeah, big improvements to game performance, better workflow. The reason why I showed it this way in this video is because the rune tower was in a dire need of updating. Just like we were doing with the Emeria crypts. So the Emeria crypts were already built with the collisions. Like I said, we would produce the low level of details first, and then from there we would make the detailed meshes. But the problem is, as you've seen, hello, it takes time to, click on a mesh, go in here, right click, level of detail, import the new levels of detail, all that kind of thing. Can be an awful lot to get through. But still, once it's done, it's done. So yeah. So yeah, that is a brief overview of how we've done collisions in Adventure In Aellion. It's not been the easiest part of production, but I've been happy with it. It's been a lot of fun to play around with. Yeah, let's show you a room you haven't really been able to see. I don't know, I'm just stalling for time. So I just want to thank everyone for watching. Hopefully I'll get better and more bearable at doing developer logs, and it won't be too much of a slog next time. But honestly, talking about collisions is pretty dry. Probably could have picked a better starting point for doing developer logs, but it was a recent update and it's been fresh on my mind after having done it. So yeah, I want to thank you all for watching, and I suppose I'll just see you around whenever. Go on, get out of here.